I met Trent. I knew of Trent. I saw him on the Middle Ground right after he first arrived here from Seattle. And as I suggested in my email, when he and his family left Seattle to move to Oklahoma, they probably reduced the conservative population of the state of Washington by 5 to 10%. There's only, what, 3 or 4 members in your family? I don't know. But anyway, now, you didn't have that big of an impact when you came, unless you become an exceedingly persuasive person, and then that's where your impact will come from. But Trent is an attorney, and I just met him this past Saturday, and that's when I asked him if he could come, and he agreed to do so. I'm really looking forward to it. He's crisscrossing the state right now doing a 4-part series. 1 is finished. He's working on 2 right now. He's going to come and give us a condensed version of number 1. We'll try to, now if you log on to OCPA's website, you can find out the locations. You're about halfway into number 2. But we'll try to have him here for 2, 3, and 4. So at this point in time, please welcome Mr. Trent England. Trent?
Thank you very much. I saw somebody with a Packers jacket back there. I'm sorry about the game. You guys played a great 58 minutes of football. Now, you do feel sort of self-conscious, when you pack up the Prius in Seattle and drive down to Oklahoma to tell people that you're a conservative, activist.
And we're all driving 4x4s down here.
That's right. So, but it has been a real blessing to become an Okie and move to a place that has so much more common sense. And we're not going to talk about it so much today, but one of my primary interests is federalism, and the frustration in a place like Washington State is that nobody cares. I mean, as far as your elected officials at the state level or at the federal level, right, that they do not care about constitutional limits. They don't care about the rule of law, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And to advance federalism, we really have to do that. We really have to win in places like Oklahoma, in 2 ways. One is sort of obvious. You need your state officials, and your federal officials too, but your state officials in particular, to stand up and make the arguments. But I tell people, really, sometimes we miss the very best argument for federalism is a well-run state, is a state that people can look at and say, I want these guys who I can at least track down and yell at, making decisions, not the guys back in Washington, D.C., right? If you've ever tried to track down and yell at an EPA bureaucrat.
James Langford,
right?
for example.
Yeah. But it really, in D.C., so much of the power is transferred to the bureaucracy. It's not even, it's hard to get an audience with a member of Congress, but functionally, in most cases, you cannot get a meaningful audience with the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. I remember the first time I went there, and you walk around and you see these buildings, and you just think, they're like the buildings that they put the space shuttle together in, right? How could there be that many cubicles in there? But that is where we are today. So this is, as Charlie mentioned, this is a condensed version of the first part of a 4-part series, and the series is called The Rule of Law and Liberty. And it's called that because those are answers to the 2 most fundamental questions in all of politics. The 2 questions that have been debated, argued about as far back as we have a record of political argument, and that is, who should rule? Who should rule? And why? What's the purpose of government? Why do we create government? Right? Some people just say, well, government's a monopoly on force. That's kind of an easy definition to use. It's problematic, though. We'll talk about why that is, right? The rule of law and liberty. Who should rule? Usually, that question has been answered in terms of a person or a group of people, right? But the founders answered it differently. They said, we want the rule of law and not of men. That's a challenge to set that up. It's fairly easy. You have some clarity when you just say, well, Charlie will be our king. Right? That you can understand.
That'd
Rule
be scary.
of law. And the flip side of that, of course, is, and this quote is in The Patriot, but this is an authentic, the movie The Patriot, it's an authentic quote from the founding era. Why would we exchange one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? Right? Which is to say, if government's just a monopoly on force, right? Democratic tyranny, monarchist tyranny, aristocratic tyranny, right? It's all the same. Unless there's an external standard to which we can hold government accountable, unless we can have something like the rule of law. And then what is government for? Right? The founders thought liberty. Right? It comes last in the preamble. They thought you had to do some other things first. They list, I love the preamble because liberty there is last, and I think it's for a reason. You have to get some other things right. And to their credit, they understood that. They weren't like the French, who thought you could just sort of yell about liberty and fraternity and you know, just sort of fire people up and through the force of your good intentions achieve those things. The founders understood that it's more complicated than that. You have to deal with human nature and set up checks and balances and separation of powers and all these things. But liberty is the goal. So we're going to talk about these two things today. So the first program is really on the big ideas behind all this. The second program that Charlie mentioned, I'm doing this one right now around the state. We were in Moore last night. We'll be in Tulsa tomorrow, and we have one in Oklahoma City coming up at our OCPA headquarters up by the Capitol. That's on federalism, the system of states, which I think is just absolutely critical to the constitutional design and also just fascinating to understand where it came from. And then the third program is on separation of powers and checks and balances, the sort of structural constitution. And then the last program is on rights. And my guarantee, I always tell people, if you come to all of them, but particularly the last one, I guarantee you will walk away smarter than your average federal judge. Because almost none of them understand rights. Some of them choose, I think this is the real tragedy, some of them choose not to. Some of them know better. And I would even put Justice Scalia in this camp sometimes. He knows better. He has a grounding from his Catholic upbringing and faith in natural rights, and yet he says, no, I can't go there. I can't look to, say, the Declaration of Independence to understand the Constitution. Whereas Clarence Thomas says, how can you claim to understand the Constitution if you don't know what it's for? And we're going to talk about that here. Unsurprisingly, I brought my cell phone. And one of the interesting things about, and this is, we're going to do just like 2 minutes on marketing. The interesting things about marketing. You can market something, you can describe something in terms of what it is, right? And this cell phone is mostly plastic, really. There's a little bit of metal in there. There's a circuit board. You know, I'm sure there's trace precious metals and there's some glass. That's what it is. And you can describe something in terms of what it does. You know, it is able to, through a microphone and the circuitry that's in there. You're all discovering I'm not a scientist, but it can take my voice and it can turn it into an electronic signal that can be bounced off a tower, bounced around, and reach someone else somewhere around the world, right? But nobody buys a cell phone for what it is or for what it does, right? And nobody markets them that way, at least not successfully, right? The third way to describe this is in terms of what it means, right? This means I could walk out the door and I can call my grandfather in Arizona. Right, and I can find out how he's doing today, how his health is. Right, I can talk to my children. Right, when they're home alone. I can reach out and connect with people and have relationships with people. Right, and that's what it means. And one of the reasons I want to talk about the rule of law and liberty is sometimes, you know, I have been a political activist. Well, I'll just tell you this. I was excited to get my driver's license, not so I could take girls out on dates, but so I could fill my back of my car with campaign signs and drive around and pound them around. My parents did not worry about me when I was out late at night. But I found myself, right, it's just easy to take, I have at least 2 of them, it's easy to take this and just sort of wave it at people and say, why don't you get it, right? I mean, look at what this is, look at what it does, right? But we forget that we care, you're here, because you already know what it means, right? And if you know what it means, then you care enough to discover what it is and what it does. right? But until we can describe what it means, we can't really persuade people to care about what it does, to care about what it is, to care about adhering to the document, right? So my focus is I want to become and help other people become better communicators, better advocates for our constitutional system by becoming better at communicating why it matters, why it's unique, what it means. And this first program is about understanding some of the things that came before, some of the precedents for the Constitution, both because it helps us to communicate about the Constitution and understand it, but it also offers us, I think, a powerful antidote to political progressivism. The progressives claim to be new, something new under the sun, and they're very much the opposite. And to show you why that's the case, we have to go back to Plato. And I love classical history, and the founders didn't so much. They were very practical people. Thomas Jefferson said, the only thing I learned from Plato was a cure for the hiccups, I guess. I haven't even read that dialogue, but apparently it's in there. But Plato records these arguments between Socrates and a variety of other Greeks, and they're fascinating. Sometimes people have read more modern philosophy and they think all philosophy is just gobbledygook. Modern philosophy is by and large written so people can achieve tenure. But ancient philosophy was written so that people could think about things. And Plato's dialogues are written, they're pretty interesting. They're written kind of like a play script, right? They're arguments about ideas. And early in Plato's Republic, there's this argument between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Socrates is saying, we need to figure out, if we're going to speculate about what is a good republic, we need to figure out what justice is, because I think that a good republic is about justice, and I think justice is something real, something that we can, at least figure out some of the contours of it. And Thrasymachus comes along and says, oh, come on, that's all sort of religious superstition, this talk about ideas. Thrasymachus says, justice is the will of the stronger. Justice is just the will of the stronger. But that sounds kind of barbaric. He said, let's not be barbaric. After all, the Greeks coined the term barbarism. Does anybody know where that came from? Barbarism. They were making fun of their neighbors. They said, when these non-Greeks talk, they just sound like they're going bar, 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 bar. And that literally is where the word barbarism came from. Yeah. He said, we're not barbarians here in Athens. We create the strongest. We create government. Justice, says Thrasymachus, is whatever government says it is. Right? Now there's an idea that you can see people today, right? If you sever yourself from the idea that there are any absolutes, right? Then maybe justice is just whatever government says it. Or to put it another way, if the majority of the people say that that's what is right, who are we to disagree? Right? We hear those kind of arguments sometimes in terms of the marriage issue. I remember probably a dozen years ago now, a debate on the marriage issue, and the head of the ACLU at the time got up and said, he said, this is just frightening. He said, I don't have to make an argument because history is on my side. And you have to decide whether you want to be rolled over by history or not. Well, there's clarity, right? Justice is the will of the stronger. Eventually, we're going to move public opinion that way, and we're a democracy, and so justice will be redefined, right? Now, still, there were some other folks in this gaggle of people hanging out with Socrates who they said, well, we're still not sure. That we can understand why that is problematic, right? Of course, you have the Persian Empire over to the east, and we're not comfortable saying that whatever the Persian emperor says is justice for that seems problematic, and a lot of people are just going to disagree with that, right? And so Glaucon, a man named Glaucon, comes along and he says, no, it's more complicated than that. Justice, cutting to the chase here, I will tell you, again, you should read this. I like just teasing people, try to get, it's interesting to read, lest you think that J.R.R. Tolkien is is quite so perfectly creative. I'm a big fan. But Glaucon says, he has this illustration. He says, what if there was a magic ring? And if you put it on, you would become invisible. And he goes through this story about, if you could put on the magic ring and you could become invisible, you could do whatever you want. And you could pin, if you did something wrong, you could pin it on somebody else, right? There'd literally be no way to prove that you did it. You could make it look like somebody else did it. And to cut to the chase here, Glaucon says, justice is a social construct. It's whatever people just feel like it is, right? This is a very multicultural idea of justice. I mean, this is exactly what you would get in some of the sociology and even philosophy classes in a major university today, right? Something between one of these two ideas. And this, I mean, again, this is going back nearly 2,500 years to find these arguments. And the arguments keep going on in history. The Greeks are very interesting. Paul goes in debates with the Greeks in the book of Acts. And he recognized that they're sort of searching for something. The Greeks are, and they develop these ideas. This is where I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but they develop these ideas through Aristotle and other thinkers that no, there really is an objective reality in the world, and it's a lot of people wonder why the Greeks achieved such dramatic accomplishments in the arts, in science, and all these things. It's because they believed in objective reality, right? They believed in cause and effect. They believed that the world has order in it, so whether it's science or philosophy or anything else, I can go out and try to understand it, right? Whether I can do that perfectly or not is a big question. The Romans came along and said, we think all that is, more or less true. But the Romans very early on said that the problem is the Greeks have not paid heed enough to human nature. And the Romans, they have skeptics and then Stoics, and they're very focused on human nature. Human nature is imperfect, and the Romans, this early period at least, they see no solution to that. Some of them say, well, let's just withdraw from public life because we believe there's an objective reality and we're likely to get it wrong. Would that we had that kind of humility in politics today, right? But of course, there's another strain that comes along to Rome that says we have an answer. We have a partial answer, right? We have an answer to why human nature has these shortcomings. And it's not a complete political answer. It's an ultimate answer in the ultimate sense. But where does this come from? Let's go back. I mentioned the Greeks, and I have to go back. There are two societies in the world who started rebelling against the assumptions that they made in the ancient world. And one of them is the Greeks, and the others, you may be guessing already, were the Hebrews, right, the Jews. And the ancient world was a place where people actually mostly seem to have thought like Thrasymachus, or maybe Glaucon, but really Thrasymachus. They said, look, we live in a tribe, or at most a city-state, and we have a temple at the middle, and we have priests on that temple, and they tell us what is right and wrong. And early on, and there are some great books written, a book written several hundred years ago called The Ancient City, just all about why they had this assumption that there wasn't anything universal. What mattered most was, your status as a member of whatever tribe you were in. There are two people groups, the Greeks and the Israelites, who came along and said, we're not sure that's really true. And the other is the Israelites. Of course, the Israelites have this pesky habit of marching around and telling people, look, you can believe in whatever you want. Right? You worship rocks and sticks and all that stuff, but we actually think our God's the real God, and He created your rocks and sticks, and that's not a popular thing to do. It wasn't a popular thing to do then. It's not a popular thing to do on a university campus today either, right? That's right. This is a claim. And you look at what the Israelites said. In some ways they were very we just think this is true. In many cases, we're not going to impose it on you. It still made them unpopular. But one of the fascinating things about this that stumped me for a little while when I first came about it is how government was set up in ancient Israel. Who were the rulers? I have some books I can give away if people want to answer my questions. Who were the rulers in ancient Israel before Samuel, or including Samuel, before Samuel? Who were the rulers? What was their title? Judges. There we go.
Thank you.
Intercollegiate Studies Institute's Guide to Psychology from a Conservative Perspective.
Okay.
That's a rare thing. They had judges. And you know, this is a little bit hard to understand in this sense, right? Gideon did not wear a black robe and carry a gavel, right? I mean, he was sort of, to non-Israelites, they may well have said, judge, king, warlord, right? What difference does the title make, right? But it makes a difference. What is different about a judge and a king? What's different about a judge and a king, sir?
The king tells you what to do. The judge only resolves disputes according to the natural law that exists outside of the people.
Amen. Amen.
Oh, shoot.
A judge, to say you're a judge, and this is true up to 100 years ago. Up to 100 years ago, everybody basically would have understood and agreed on this. To say I am a judge is to say I am a person under authority. I am an authority, but I am bound by a higher authority. Whether it is the common law, which was grounded in natural law, rightly understood, or whether it was statute law, or whether it was God's law, right? To say I'm a judge is to say I am almost like a translator for the higher authority, right? Into specific situations, specific disputes, right? To say you're a king. And this is, you read about that transition, and it is there, but it's you sort of have to focus on it. There's a lot going on. Because the point is made in Scripture. God says, I was their king. Right? Which means that it wasn't that they just had a judge. They still had a system of kingship, right? But it was a real authority, not a human claiming authority, right? And a judge there to translate all this into situations that people faced. Right? And this makes sense if you believe, and particularly if you have access to, a higher law. Right? And this flows into Rome, and this flows into Augustine, and many other people. Augustine usually, though, is read as a theologian. But Augustine says some things about government that make a lot of sense if you put all this sort of together, right? We believe there are external absolute realities. We believe that we can know about them imperfectly. We believe that all of us, including whoever is in charge of our government, should be held accountable to them. And yet apparently, even in the Roman Empire, there were people like Thrasymachus who said, justice is just the will of the stronger. It's just whatever the emperor says it is, whatever the governor says it is, right? Why would we question that? And Augustine makes this great statement. The Wall Street Journal actually ran this on their editorial page a few years ago, which I just love. But he says, to paraphrase a little bit, he says, look, if government is just the will of the stronger, if government is just a monopoly on force, as some people say today, right, then there is no difference between a prince and a pirate, right, between a king and a brigand, right, except that maybe the king has a bigger army and is better organized. Right? But if there is no external standard to which government is accountable, it is organized crime, right? And organized crime really isn't organized crime. It's just government. They're the same thing. Right? Augustine says there has to be a standard. And part of this too is he looks around and he says, we talk about justice, but the frustrating thing then and now, right, is that we talk about holding government to a higher standard, but so infrequently does that actually happen. We see so much corruption. We see so much, at that time very obviously, but I think today, government condoned violence against people or groups of people. Right? And Augustine says we have a problem here, right? We want to hold government to this external standard, and we actually have to do it, because when we don't do it, we discredit that standard, which I think is very perceptive. You sell Bastiat's The Law, right? And Bastiat makes this same point. Bastiat says that when government holds up a standard that conflicts with what people know is right and wrong, with the rules that are written on our heart, I believe, right? That people are left with two choices. Either they have to conclude that there is no natural law, that there is no objective standard, or they have to turn on their government, right? But government leaves them with no alternatives in that case. Okay, so the Romans, this idea, Thomas Aquinas, I have to go very quickly to Thomas. Thomas Aquinas, though, is an amazing thinker. As a young man, he's from a wealthy family, and his family wants him to become a priest. It's just sort of a respectable thing for someone to do, and he wants to become a monk. He wants to take a vow of poverty, which doesn't make his parents very happy. And I have to tell you the story because it speaks to his character and just to how fascinating these stories are. But he tries to run away and join the monastery, and his family kidnaps him, brings him back, locks him in a room, and says, "We know how to convince a young man." They send a young lady in that they had found somewhere in the town to try to persuade him. Yeah, and Thomas Aquinas, who otherwise is known as the dumb ox, very sedate, just would sit and just think about things. He realizes what's going on. He grabs what does it say? Flee from immorality. He grabs a hot poker out of the fire. He chases this young woman out of the room. He carves these sort of wood burns on the wooden door across. And his family says, "We give up. You win." And he spends the rest of his life writing. And he is obsessed by this question of we see through a glass darkly, but we still see. Right? There's still an objective reality out there. And as imperfectly, and he writes with great humility, because he writes in the form of sort of questions and answers, and he cites old authorities, and sometimes he says, "I'm just not sure." Again, just refreshing humility in some of his writings, which are just voluminous and amazing. But he's obsessed with this. He says that we have got to develop our understanding of this natural law, of what this objective standard is, so that we can live by it, so that we can hold it up as a standard. And he systematizes all this. And one of the things that he writes, just to give you a little tidbit, it sounds so much like Thomas Jefferson. He writes, one translation of this statement, he writes in Latin, but he writes that man is equal in his rights, though not in any other way. Right? Sounds very much like the Declaration. One of his conclusions, part of the natural law, is there is something about human beings, some way in which we are equal and all deserving of the same dignity, even though in every other way we are different. And I'm gonna skip ahead a little. I'm gonna skip right ahead almost to the Declaration because I want to give an illustration both for Aquinas and for the Declaration about what this means. Does somebody have a penny? I don't. Never.
A pen or
a penny. A penny. Yeah. I just never carry any pocket change, which is unfortunate. Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay, this is a great penny. This is shiny. So
people ask for dollars, but
no, I'm cheap. I mean, it's inflation will get us in the end. So this penny. This penny looks a lot like, there are a lot of other pennies that look very, very much like this. And yet, there are a lot of pennies that don't. And we could all dump our pocket change out on the table. And we could distinguish most of them. After all, some have dates and things stamped on them, but different dates. But we could go to a mint, and we could put our hand out. We could catch two pennies rolling out, one after the other, that to our eyes would be absolutely indistinguishable. And yet, we could take them down to OU, where I suspect they have an electron microscope, and we could find a scientist there who could always tell us that at the material level, every penny is different and distinguishable, right? And yet, nothing, not how shiny it is, not how many, exactly how many molecules of copper are in this. None of those physical characteristics are the reason why he had this in his pocket, right? And in terms of why he had this in his pocket and why we carry these around, right? They are all equal, right? All of the pennies are equal. And they are designed in such a way that even though they are all materially different, they are stamped with an imprint by their maker, designed to communicate to us that they all have the same value, though materially they are different, sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes in ways that takes great scientific advances to define. Right? And this is the argument, I think, in the Declaration. But I do jump ahead just a little bit. Because I have to say something about the Enlightenment and the argument there, which I think sometimes is misunderstood. One of the things, so I don't like the term Enlightenment because I think that it was a term that people came up with actually to dismiss a lot of what had come before, especially from thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and other scholastics and theologians. We'll use the term, the Enlightenment. One of the interesting things about the Enlightenment was that there was a lot of agreement on one of the questions, right? There's a lot of agreement that people do deserve a certain common dignity, that they have some rights that are the same, that government should try to protect justice. There actually was some agreement on that. Where people really differed was on their understanding of human nature. I want to illustrate that by contrasting Thomas Hobbes with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And sometimes people look at these writers and they say, well, these people were way out. They were at loggerheads. Right? Now, I actually think it's important, partly because it helps us deal with some of the conflicts among the American founders, to see that they had certain things in common, certain objectives in common, and an understanding of human nature that was very, very different. And Hobbes and Rousseau are sort of our bookends for this. Because Hobbes said, who knows the famous Thomas Hobbes quote, or some part of it? He said, life in a state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short, and he goes on, but that's the most popular part of that quote. I don't know if he had a bad dating experience as a young man or something, but he really had a dim view of human nature. And because of that, he writes the book, The Leviathan. And he says, look, if we want justice, the only way we're going to get it is to create something sort of like a totalitarian state, and then keep our fingers crossed. This is my gloss on Hobbes. Keep our fingers crossed that totalitarian state will have our best interests at heart, right? Which, again, if you believe that human nature is quite that dismal and perhaps unredeemable, right? There's a lot of speculation that Hobbes was sort of fallen into atheism and really believed that he believed that human nature was imperfect, very much so, but he didn't believe there was any real way to mitigate that other than just by brute force. And so this is what he says we should aspire to if we want, but still if we want justice. Rousseau, on the other hand, says that a state of nature would be like a return to Eden, right? That all of the problems we see around us are caused by things that we have constructed, social constructs like government, like the family, right? Rousseau says if we could just break all of our bonds with the past and break down all of these structures, we would set human nature free to be as wonderful as it is. Right? But he's still, in a way, Rousseau may be almost an outlier here, but it's still aspiring to something that looks a lot like justice, right? So he still thinks that there is an objective reality. It's just that his view of human nature is so totally different. And then you could place John Locke somewhere in between, and you could place the American founders somewhere in between, but of course not at just a point, but occupying a space on that spectrum in between, because you have people like Thomas Jefferson, who flirts with the French Revolution a little bit, right? He has some of these ideas about maybe human nature, he sounds Rousseauian at times. And then you have others, maybe you could say John Jay. You read some of what he wrote in the Federalist Papers, and I would say I think a lot of the American founders who were involved in foreign policy took this view. They were very, very concerned that without a strong government, that the excesses of human nature, whether it was from foreign powers or domestically, would overcome you, right? And so you see them occupying a space on this line. Now, how am I on time here, Charlie?
You got about 10 more minutes.
Oh, about 10 more minutes till questions, or about 10 more
Till
minutes
questions.
period? Oh, till questions. Okay.
And we'll make the questions short today.
Okay. Well, and I will. I'm actually going to try to wrap up in 5 minutes if I can. So, okay, so this is the contention, and again, the whole thing is online because I have to skip over talking more about the Declaration of Independence, but we'll leave it at that, right? The founders really believed, right, that you could achieve something like the rule of law. They believed in the natural law. They didn't. Some of the terms had baggage at that point, to be totally blunt, because of people's views on Catholicism and natural law, qua natural law being associated with Catholicism, but they still shared a belief that was like that. And that little fragment of intellectual history is interesting, but not really important to us today. But of course, there always are. There's always another side. There's always a Thrasymachus. There's always a Glaucon. There's always someone out there who views these ideas and the government that they create, right? Because the Declaration is right. It says if you believe in this, right, government should rest in some way on the people. And there are always folks who think that that's a little too scary, right? And divine right of kings at this time was it was already really it had been largely discredited, I think, by the time of the American founding. I mean, after the Glorious Revolution in Britain, there were a lot of checks put on kings. There was a lot of talk in Europe about ways to limit kings and constitutional monarchies and all of this. But another idea comes along, and the idea starts, perhaps unsurprisingly, looking back, at graduate school. It starts in the university. It starts in Germany. And it starts with a fellow who tells his students, he says, look, we know that question, who should rule? Well, we know who should rule, right? Because we know that really history is about progress. History is an incline. And at any given time, humanity is spread out along a segment of that incline, right? And who should rule? Right? Well, Professor Hegel says, well, it's whoever is the most progressed, right? The furthest up that incline. And of course, think of how seductive this is. He's talking to a bunch of grad students, right? He's talking to people who instantly know, well, we are the most progressed. We are the ones.
Or at least that much taller than everyone else.
That's right. And Hegel says, I'll give you an inflammatory quote. Hegel says, in the past, an inflammatory quote that sounds like Woodrow Wilson 100 years later. Hegel says, in the past, men read the Bible because they believed in these absolute truths. We now today know that that's all superstition. Again, sounds like the ancient Greeks. We know that's all superstition. In the future, men will not wake up in the morning and read the Bible. They'll wake up in the morning and read the newspaper. Because the most important thing is the most current thing. Hegel also said, this is mind-bogglingly self-serving, he said the most current philosophy is always the best, right? Whatever's going on right now is always the best. It's like these people today, I don't know if I'm old enough to say this, but these young people today, right, who act like you can't understand how to use an iPhone, that you're just irrelevant, right? My daughter just got an iPod Touch thing, and so I'm faced with that. But and this is the idea, and this sweeps Germany, right? By the end of the 19th century, the idea in Germany, the ideal for government had been, let's find these people, let's create a massive educational infrastructure, create these people, and then put power in their hands, right? This will be our solution to war and poverty and politics, right? A solution really is presented as a solution to politics. What is politics? Politics is us having an argument in some kind of a structure that's designed to sort of provide some rules and hopefully move things towards justice, right? A political system is supposed to be something like that. They don't want that. Woodrow Wilson says that what we progressives are trying to do is move to an upland where the mere talk of politics is stilled, right? This is Wilson saying this 100 years later, right? This is the objective. This is this becomes, when it hops the Atlantic, right, with the early American progressives, this becomes the first great critique. There were others, but the first wholesale reimagining of the American founding, right, and the Constitution, to where a few decades later, Franklin Roosevelt would, at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, running for re-election, he would say, that old Declaration of Independence, you know what that was about? It was a contract between the rulers and the ruled, And I should just read the quote because there's no way I can paraphrase it as powerfully as he has. The reading packet is also online, and a few copies are over there. Lots of literature over there, but a few of these, but it's also online. This is what FDR says in 32. It's not wartime. He's running for re-election. And this is the remaking of the Declaration of Independence. He says, it discusses the problem of government in terms of a contract. Government is a relation of give and take. A contract, if we would follow the thinking out of which it grew, under such a contract, rulers were accorded power. On consideration, a contract term there, it means an exchange of things of value. Rulers were accorded power on consideration that they be accorded, the people consented to that power on consideration that they be accorded certain rights. The task of statesmanship has always been the redefinition of these rights in terms of a changing and growing social order. Right? So government and the people aren't creating government in this equation. Government is there already somehow. And the people go to government perhaps and say, we want some more rights. And government says, well, of course. All you have to do is give us more power. Right? Or government goes to the people and says, if you only gave us more power, we could give you more rights. And everybody wins. What startles me about this is a bald-faced lie. Right? Calvin Coolidge knew it. Calvin Coolidge recognized that you should read his speech on the sesquicentennial of the Declaration of Independence. So this is 1926, July 5th. The 4th was a Sunday, so that was a day of rest. But they celebrated on the 5th. He gives a great speech, and he says this isn't progress. He says this is a return to barbarism. That's what that is. I like Calvin Coolidge. So with that, I've got to close. I want to take your questions, but the Constitution, right, is part of this long argument about liberty that will always go on, right, as long as there is human government, right? But one of the things I take from this is we stand on the shoulders of, not only Coolidge and Jefferson, right, but Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, and you go all the way back, right? People who have fought this fight before and offered very, very much to us in the records that are left. The argument for liberty, the argument that has become for us, right? Our great blessing is we actually have a document. We have the Constitution that we can hold up and say, this is how we achieve those things, and let us tell you why these things are good. So with that, I hope you'll pick up some literature, and I hope you have lots of questions. Okay.
First off, just briefly, I'm of the opinion Coolidge was the finest president we had in the 20th century.
Amen.
Amen. Okay. Next one here, you were talking earlier about the Declaration and the mention of liberty toward the end of that, and just something fired off in me, and I would like to ask your opinion of that. Would you suggest, now, I know our founders, they declared that Declaration of Independence, and their objective was liberty. But would it be unfair to suggest that actually liberty is the byproduct or the fruit of good government?
I don't know if I would phrase it exactly that way. I guess the way I would put it really is in terms of, I guess the Declaration has it true, right? Because it talks about safety and happiness, and but I love the preamble, right? Because you can, you could achieve liberty in a state of nature, right? A little historical truth. Yeah, right. But when you get a bunch of people together in that state of nature, then things will go awry, right? So I think that
wouldn't that be license rather than liberty?
Yes, but I guess the caveat that maybe I would throw in there is we can achieve that liberty is the fruit of good government, which starts with government of the self, right? And so when government in any of whether it's the structures that we think of in politics or our own self-government, when any of those things goes awry, yeah, we will lose our liberty.
You talked about, my final question, we'll step aside here. You talked about Chief Justice, forget his name now. Scalia and his, he should have known better. is not as conservative as he should be or as good, based upon his Catholic upbringing and his understanding of natural law. Actually, I would suggest that Thomas, who probably had one of the most difficult confirmation processes of any judge that actually succeeded in being confirmed, the real objection to him was his belief in natural law. Would you?
I think that's exactly right. And you can, yeah.
His understanding and his belief, and it's why, in my opinion, he's the finest justice on the court.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And you can, there was a little bit of questioning about that there. I mean, but of course they would rather go to the salacious things than admit that there's that divine. I mean, when Thomas was at the EEOC, right? That's where he was before. He went through a period of time where, and this is a great. This just strikes me as being very much like some of the founders. He basically said, I recognize that I don't know enough about some of these ideas. And he used his part of the staff budget that he had to hire people who were some of the finest experts on this. I think Ken Masugi was one. He's a great scholar of the American founding. To hire them to come and work like bureaucratic staff jobs, so that Thomas could spend time talking with these people and being around them and coming to understand this, right? And it's James Madison, leading up to the Constitutional Convention, one of the most well-educated people in North America, is just pouring through books and ruining his health, right? Sacrificing everything because he just has to learn more. He has to dig deeper. I mean, it's the scholarship, the great scholarship of patriotism.
Mr. England, I'd like to say you are a refreshing young man. And we'd like to have you here early and often. At least that's my view. I don't know if anyone else agrees.
You're saying that
And here's my question for you. If I had to summarize your presentation today, it would be something along the lines that law is not created, law is discovered. And that is the work of judges and politicians and of each and every man, to discover law and then to follow it. And so here's my question for you. As you heard Charlie introduce you, he talked about 2016 being a very important cycle. Have you looked on the map since you moved here to see where you live legislatively? And will you be running for a House or Senate seat, or could you move to a place to do
maybe
that?
governor.
That's a serious question.
I do.
Or we can tell you where to move.
I forget. I forget the district number, but I do. No, I have. The first part of your question is very much correct, and it's actually why. And this is. I'd love to have time to do more scholarship on the common law, right? Because today a lot of people look at that and they say, well, judge-made law, right? We don't want judge-made law. If your judges really, and I'm not saying we could get back to this, right? Because it's a very hard thing to do. But if your judges really believe they are discovering principles that are true, and they talked in those terms. I mean, that was the assumption. And also, I suppose countervailingly, if people believe that it was not good behavior, if your judges did not take that view, right? Then the common law is actually the most beautiful, and I use that term intentionally, it's a beautiful system of regulation because it works on a case-by-case basis showing actual harm, right? And so all this regulation we have today, all the things that the EPA does, if we had a robust common law, the way England used to, right? Not to say that it would be perfect, but it certainly would be better than a bunch of EPA people just sort of coming up with things, right? So as to the second part of your question, I ran for the legislature in Washington State, and,
It's in your blood. That's good.
and one of the things I realized, and this is one of the things I realized is that I had just worked at the Heritage Foundation. That's where I came from, and I moved back home, and I ran for a district that at the time nobody was willing to run against this young state House member named Derek Kilmer. And I said, if nobody takes him out on his first reelect, he'll wind up in Congress, and he's in Congress today. But he bounced to a Senate seat, and the seat became open, and there was a Republican primary, and I lost. One of the challenges is in our politics, and this isn't to say I would never do that again, but so much of it has become so superficial, right? And I really, and maybe there's more potential here, right? But it's so frustrating to run for office when the whole contest is it's just not about ideas, right? It's about impressions. It's about
You would have to
celebrity.
reduce everything you just said today into a 7 to 9 word bumper sticker.
right.
You can't be done.
Yeah. So I don't, to be honest, I think that so much of what we need to do right now, and I think this is an obligation for people who are elected as well, is to educate people and really to inspire people, right? One of the most remarkable achievements of the progressives is that they have managed to make people think history is boring. Right, which is no surprise. History to the progressives. You think about that incline, right? You think about, they say everything's going up. So it kind of explains why when they teach history, they go back to the sledgehammer, right? Racists, slave owners, right? The founders were just a bunch of, what do they say? A bunch of patriarchs, and they were sexist, and they were smugglers, is what I was looking, right? They go back to history with a sledgehammer. They want to teach history a lesson rather than if you understand. If you understand human nature, right, and justice is a constant, then you understand there's so much to learn from going back to history, and it is fascinating and it's inspiring. And if we can just inspire young people to want to figure it out, to want to learn it, that is where we turn our country back. Right? It's not just about making people, it's not just about being people who like the founders, right? We need people who are like the founders, right? Who are inspired by these ideas and inspired to learn more and to do more. And I think a lot of that's going on. I mean, so much in private Christian schools and homeschooling, there's so much of that happening today, far more than when I was young, when I was a kid in school. And so I don't know. I think I see real signs of hope, actually. Glimmers of hope, bright glimmers.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's give him a hand here. And I will just give you a word of advice here, a bit of understanding. I try to tell this to all candidates. When you're running for office, it's not time to educate. You educate once you're in office, okay? You're running for office because the electorate out there is fairly dumbed down. I'm sorry. If you don't understand that, run from office sometime. Go door to door and talk with people. Okay? But there's good news and bad news. The objective is to get in office, to appeal to people in such a way that like Trent. Okay? And once you get in, you can do the right thing because nobody will be watching you. The bad news is, if you're running against a bad guy and he gets in, he can do the wrong thing and get away with it because nobody's watching him. So the objective is to get there without violating your principles by appealing to people, and once you're there, move Oklahoma the right direction, make the differences, and then use your position to educate people from that point on. I would say this, and next week we will have 4 lawmakers here, like we had last week, we had 4. And one of those will be Jason Murphy. Yeah. Whether you like Murphy or not, I will tell you one thing. He's probably been the most skilled person I've ever seen to educate the people of his district. And he does that. He's written an email every week for he's finished 8 years, for 8 years now. Yeah. And this is a very educational thing, and he's actually made his district more conservative since he's been there by educating them. It's an amazing piece that he writes on a weekly basis. And because of that, when the state chamber came after him this year with one of their handpicked little fellows that turned out to be a dud, and they never ended up putting the money into it, Jason just wins his race with 84% victory in a Republican primary because people understand and know what he's what he stands for. He's proven himself to be a man of integrity over and over and over again, and over and over and over again, and not like a typical politician. And so he's used that position as a great launching pad. And as I say, once we find out where you live, if you need to move, we'll tell you where to move. Okay. So thank you so much for coming. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
I sat here for a reason.
Yes.